Hi, today I'm going to walk through setting up something called email OAuth 2.0 Proxy. The reason I want to walk through these instructions is that I think it would be particularly helpful. I know that if I had them when I needed them, it would have been very, very helpful. A few weeks ago, I was asked to take an existing PHP application. It was like this legacy PHP app that was written by one guy and who had since left the company, and nobody knew how to maintain it. It has no documentation. There's no dev environment. There's no tests. There's no comments, and it's an application that's heavily relied on in this company. So I was asked with like a week to spare, something like that. Can we, would I be able to take this app and make it compliant with OAuth 2? With Microsoft deprecating basic authentication. And so I was certainly up for giving it a shot, but it was quite interesting trying to come up with a strategy for making a change to this application. It wasn't just as simple as, okay, so fine, you don't have instructions for a dev environment, but the database was something like, something like a couple hundred gigs. It was just ridiculously huge. So I couldn't easily take a copy, like a dump of the database, and put it on my laptop and grab the code and try to do any kind of local testing. It made me very leery of making any changes on the server. So how was I going to make this application work with OAuth 2 and Exchange? It seemed like a daunting task, and so I was Googling around, and I finally stumbled on this project here, email OAuth 2 Proxy. And the beginning of the first sentence of the description here, transparently add OAuth 2 support to IMAP. And I'm thinking, is that possible? Is that what I think it is? Because if it is, that potentially means no code changes to this extremely brittle application. And so the long story short is that I did manage to get this installed, and I got Exchange and Azure set up properly, and there were no code changes. The only change we had to make in the actual code was a change to the host that IMAP connected to. So just to point to the proxy, and then the proxy off to Office 365 or Exchange. So I figured I've been watching this project on GitHub here for a little while, and there's definitely been a number of people seem to have issues getting. I know it was tricky for me. The OAuth mechanism, I guess you could call it, is the client credential flow, and that's where the user's not directly involved. It's when you have an application on a server and it needs to use OAuth. Well, this is a way to set up OAuth in a way that you don't need that external interaction, and all the grants are applied by the administrator on the server. And so I'm going to walk through setting up Azure and Exchange, and then we're also going to build a virtual machine that I've got, like a Vagrant and VirtualBox virtual machine. If you want to walk through it really step by step with me, we'll get that going. And then finally, install email OAuth 2 Proxy, and then test that out with just a really simple PHP app. So I'll have this. I'll close this here, and I've got the step-by-step instructions here that I'll link to in the description. And then you'll clone the repository, and then you can follow along and run the same VM that I am. So before we get started here, maybe what I'll do is I'll get the VM building, like I'll get that going. Actually, sorry, I already did get that going, and you can see that it's all this takes a bunch of time, and I got that built before. But the command to do that is vagrant up, and so you just go to the root of the project. In this case, the directory off the root of the project, and do vagrant up, and it'll it'll bring the VM up configured and ready to go. So we'll leave that for now, and we'll go back to the instructions. And so the first thing we need to do is get to Azure. So I've got Azure up here, and we'll go back to the instructions. So it says to go to Active Directory, app registrations, new registration. So we'll go to Azure Active Directory, and then down here on the left, app registrations, and then new registration. And I'm going to call this John test. And we leave this at single tenant and click register. And we'll go back. Next, we'll create a client secret. So I'll just go over here and add the secret. And new client secret. I'm going to call it just John test client secret. And just 6 months is fine, right? This is just for a test. And on this page, you want to pay attention to grabbing the value. See this column, the value column, and you want to copy that secret, that client secret, not the secret ID, but the secret value, right? So we'll copy that, and I'm going to put it in a Notepad text file here. I'm just going to put in the client secret there, and we'll use this later. If you don't copy it, you won't be able to see this again. Like once you refresh this page, for security reasons, that won't display. So open up a file. I'd suggest open up a file and save it there. And I also put my email address up here, or this is the mailbox account that you want to have access to. So we'll save that, and we'll just keep that there and grab these values later when we need them. Okay, so back to the instructions. So we created the client secret. Next, we want to add permissions. So we go to API permissions, add permission, APIs my organization uses. So we go to API permissions, and we go add permission, and APIs my organization uses. So we've got a huge list there. And what we want to do is search for Office 365 Exchange Online. So I'll just copy that and search. And you can see that come up. We want to select that. And then it says, okay, we want to go to click application permissions and then search for and select IMAP access as app. So we're going to do application permissions and then search for IMAP access as map. We'll expand that and select that permission and add it. And at the bottom here, we add it, and then we want to click grant admin consent and click yes. If you don't see this, you're going to have somebody who does have permission to do this. But in my case, like I set up a test account with Office 365 and I'm the admin, so I can grant that. And click yes. And so that actually leaves us at a point where we've configured, we've done everything we have to do with Azure in terms of configuration, but now we have to configure Exchange, right? Because that's what we want to access. So we want to first start to configure Exchange. We have to do this through PowerShell. And I've got PowerShell up here. Make sure that you launch it as the administrator, like when you right-click on it, run as administrator. And let's go back to the instructions. This here, we're installing these modules, Azure AD, Active Directory, and Exchange Online Management. So we copy that, and we'll paste that in. And that should, and yeah, so it's warning us about this. It says it's an untrusted repository. From what I understand, PS Gallery is a trustworthy repository. So I'm just going to put in A here for all, and we're just now installing both of those. And I'll go back here while it's doing that. So we installed the modules, and that's doing that right now. And then next we want to import the modules, because now we're going to run some commands that reference functionality in those modules. So that completed, and now we're doing the import module, and we're going to import both of those. And we go back to the instructions. Here I want to set these variables because we're going to use them in the commands down here. And instead of having to copy and paste while we're doing that, let's put them into variables and then we'll reference them. So I'm going to copy this. So tenant ID, and here to get the tenant ID, go to overview and we go back here, right? So we got directory or tenant ID, we'll copy that. And we put that in. Make sure that you got quotes around the value. And then, so we got tenant, now we want client ID. And let's go back to Azure and get the client. So that's application or client ID. We copy that. And there we go. The next one was the mailbox. So that's the, if we go back to Notepad, wherever Notepad is, there we go. Sorry, I'll get that one in there first. So the mailbox, we want to set that to the account that we want to access, the mailbox account. So in this case, that's the same as my administrator account. That's actually my account. But for you, it likely is different. Next, okay, so we got the mailbox. And so we're going to first connect to Azure. Okay, so we're running Azure here and we're specifying the tenant ID. And it's going to prompt us to authenticate. So I'm going to use my credentials here as the administrator. So you'll put your, you'll authenticate as your user. And I've got a password here that I need to authenticate with. Okay, oops. And I'll just skip this, but you can see here that we've now authenticated. And we'll now connect to Exchange. So we've got Azure and then Exchange, and then we'll be able to grab information from Azure and use it with our commands to Exchange. So I'm already signed in. I'll just do that again for Exchange. We'll skip that for now. And that's done. And here we want to get the service principal from Azure. So we'll grab that. And we've got, you can see how we're referencing the client ID, or Azure calls it the app ID. And so we did that. And actually what this has done, if I do service principal, what is that, RL I think, or LR? Oh, what is that command? FL. There, now you can see that this is the details of the service principal. And we'll go back to the instructions, close that. So now next we want to configure the service principal in Exchange. So this command is now going to Exchange. We got the data from Azure and now we're configuring it in Exchange. And we did that. And now that we've got the principal in Exchange, we need to grant the principal access, full access in this case, to the mailbox. Okay. Oops. Let's try that again. There. Okay, so next I've got build dev environment. We know that that's been accomplished, and now we want to install email OAuth 2.0 Proxy. The Vagrant SSH, if you're running it on Windows and through Cygwin, there's a bug, and so you can't use Vagrant SSH without some issues. If you hit Control-C to control break out of a program, it'll mess up your terminal. So I actually have a workaround for that, and so this is just an SSH command. So with the details of grabbing the port, what's the guest port on the VM, and anyway, so we'll walk through that here. So just to log into the VM, you just do bin ssh VM, and yes, and I like using tmux, and I'm going to split this so that we can have multiple panes per window. And let's see, what do we want to do first? Go back to the instructions. So we SSH in, we want to get the release of OAuth, email OAuth 2.0 Proxy. So this is as of, this morning, November 3rd. This is early morning. This is the most recent. Okay, and then we'll unzip that and cd into the directory. And from here, we'll then run this command to install the requirements. You'll notice the no GUI requirements. This is because we're running it on the server behind the scenes, and we'll get all those installed. Next, now that we've got that, all of the requirements for OAuth 2.0 Proxy, email OAuth 2.0 Proxy are installed, we want to make a copy of the sample config. Now, the original config for email OAuth 2.0 Proxy is quite verbose, so I've distilled it down to exactly what we need, as just minimally. And so we'll just click. I've got this open in the root of the project of the video directory anyway. And what do we want here? We want this sample one. We want to copy, Control-C and paste. And we want to rename that to emailproxy.config. And here we just, we're defining the service. We're going to listen to port 1993 as opposed to 993, and that's going to, we're running it on, localhost. And for the account email, we'll go back to our notepad and grab the email address and paste it in there. And next we see we've got the tenant ID that we need to replace. And we'll go back to Azure for that. And we'll get the tenant ID. Go back to the config. So there's the tenant. Next is the client ID, which is the application ID as far as Azure is concerned. And then here we want the client secret. Go back to the credentials file and grab the secret and paste it in there. Okay, so now we'll save that and we'll go back to the instructions. Okay, now it says we want to create a backup of the original config. So I know that we're already in this directory, so we'll move or rename that file. So here we'll do this, move email config, right? Email proxy config to the original. And then what we want to do is make a symbolic link to /vagrant. And if you're not familiar with Vagrant, by default maps /vagrant to the root of where the Vagrant file is defined. So or where you've launched it there, where you've launched Vagrant up. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a symbolic link from this directory to our shared directory in Windows to reference that config that we just made. And let's go back here. Okay, so that's all set up. We can do a cat on the email proxy config, just sort of show it there. That looks right. Go back to our browser and the instructions. So next we're going to test. We're going to test the setup using Apache PHP and IMAP. And so I've got the proxy there, and then we'll do this first. So on the window on the right here, we'll get Apache going. And I have a script that will basically launch the Docker container. And we just want to change this username to IMAP username. We'll change that to the email address of the user. And the password. Because this isn't Basic Auth anymore, right? the password it's not used for authenticating to Exchange, but the password still has a use with email OAuth 2 Proxy. I'm going to just put this in password 1. And for now, it doesn't really matter what you specify because we've got it all set up through OAuth 2. But then after we do this test, I'm going to set up the client credentials so that it's encrypted, which is a way to secure, to add some security to the installation. But we'll get to that after we do this initial test. So in that case, that's where password is going to be important. But right now, the password doesn't play a role. So we'll start it up, and because I've got a Docker container here that it's going to run, it has to go out and grab the image from Docker, and hopefully this won't. Before when I was at test, well, yeah. So I was going to say before when I test it seems to pause sometimes, and I don't know if like by hitting enter it seems to help. I'm not totally sure why. Anyway, I'm not sure. Maybe I'm dreaming, but anyway, so we've got Apache running, and we'll go back to the instructions. So then view PHP app. So we'll open that link in a new tab, and you can see now that we've got the web server up and we're accessing the port. If you want to test the link here, PHP info, you can see that. Just want to show you that I've got IMAP installed. And we can close that. And so the next thing to do here, and maybe I didn't. Yeah, actually, I skipped starting up the proxy, so I got to get that started. So we'll do that on the other side here on the left, and you'll see it says here listening for authentication requests. Connect your email client to begin. So our email client is actually the PHP app. And I'll bring that up here. So in, there it is, test IMAP connect. And you can see that it's grabbing the username and password from the environment. And this all gets translated by the proxy, those requests, but this will connect to the mailbox and then it'll loop through the messages. Okay, so let's see if we can't. It's going to bring that up with that. Okay, let's see if this works. So I'm going to click on Test IMAP Connect. And sure enough, it actually worked the first time. So that's pretty cool. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to send myself an email just to prove that this is working. And I'll just give it a couple seconds. So I just sent it. Now I'll hit refresh and just see if we end up seeing it. No, not yet. So we've got 2 of these testing 1, 2, 3. So let's refresh that again. And there it is. Now we've got 3 of them. So we know that that's working, which is really cool. And you can see that there's lots of things happening here in the logs. Between the PHP app and the proxy. Let's go back to the instructions. Okay, so we've got these set up and we proved that it works. One thing I'll try just for demonstration purposes is I'm shutting down Apache and I'm going to change the password here to password 2. And if you take a look at, if we do a refresh here, you'll notice that it doesn't have any impact, right? The password doesn't, it's not authenticating through those means anymore. But what we will do now is encrypt the client secret, and that's where the password matters, because when we send the proxy the password, we're going to configure it so that this config here, encrypt client secret on first use. When that's the case, it's going to use the password we send it to encrypt the client secret, and then so any subsequent requests have to have that correct password. So it's pretty cool because it ends up encrypting the key, the client secret, which is nice, and then but it also ends up becoming an authentication mechanism for the clients connecting to the proxy. You have to have the right password. Now, and otherwise it won't decrypt. The client secret can't be decrypted properly. Okay, so I want to show you, before we do the encryption, I want to bring up the sample. So like, you'll remember that we set this up, but you might notice that we didn't set an access token or the access token expiry. And you'll notice it even more so now if we do a view word wrap. And you'll notice, like, okay, there's this config file. It grew considerably since we originally made it. And that's because the application actually stores these values. It reads the config in, but it also uses the config as a config store, which is a little unusual. I was kind of surprised at it. And one thing that you have to really be careful about is so I say, okay, well, I want to set this to encrypt client secret on first use. So I set it to true, right? And then I go back to the app, and I'm not sure why that. Oh, did I? Let's the Control C that. Let's start that Apache again. Okay, so we're gonna stop the proxy, and we'll go back to the proxy config in Visual Studio Code, and you'll notice that this was set back to false. And that's because when we stop the application dumps the config back to the config file. So if you want to make any config file changes, you need to make sure you make them when the application isn't running. So we're going to set this to true. And we're also going to get rid of these. In order for this to be, in order for this to work, and for it to be the first use, we can't have a valid access token in there. So we have to take out what we didn't add, right? This is what the application added when we set up the connection to Exchange. So let's save that, and we're saying encrypt on first use, and we've got our client secret listed there. So we want to see what happens now when we start the proxy. So we'll start the proxy up again, and we'll go, let's see if anything has changed yet. It doesn't look like anything's changed, but we haven't used it yet. So let's go back to the this list here. So we're going to run the command to connect and get the emails. So it's doing its thing, and it's done. It worked. And now when we look at the config, you'll notice that this has been written to now. But where's the client secret? The client secret is not there anymore. It's got the token salt, access token, and then down here, it's now got client secret encrypted. Okay, so that's pretty cool, because now that's encrypted and we've got a more secure situation. It's not wide open, and we can test that by going back to let's go back to our Apache install, and we'll shut down Apache, and here we'll change the password to, like, say, to password 3. It was at password 2 when we were testing it there, when we generated the encrypted the client a secret. So now we'll change it to password 3 and go back to our browser and hit refresh, and now we get I cannot authenticate to IMAP server. So you can see that this is working now. If we go, or sorry, it's working in the sense that it's keeping us locked out because we don't have the right password. If we change the password back to password 2, and we go here and refresh, now it was able to decrypt the password properly and do its and have the proper credentials to set up the connection with OAuth. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I need to cover here. Yeah, I think that's basically it. Yeah, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the comments. And I really hope that people find this useful. I know if I had these instructions, it would have been a big help. So anyway, let me know what you think, and I'll see you in the next video.